The flat hat that's most often called a boater, but also commonly called a skimmer or a basher, is made from woven senet straw. The straw is plaited and woven at angles, and the hat is typically the natural straw color, although usually with a wide plain or striped grosgrain ribbon band. Hats are typically slightly elliptical and have a flat crown and a thick flat brim. The style of hat was purportedly based on flat hats worn by sailors. It was invented in the town of Luton in Bedfordshire, which was a center for straw hat making from the 17th century. While the design seems simple, they actually have made many different styles over the years. In 1822, one London shop offered 42 different styles. The Huntington Press of Huntington, Indiana noted in 1922, last year's style saw a predominance of saucer brims. Just what variety will be in favor next year is rather doubtful. The hat was particularly suited to summer, being light but strong, and was commonly worn doing summer activities such as boating, thus its most common name. Straw hats did have their difficulty, though. They tended to warp when wet, and as one New Yorker noted in the Daily News in May of 1922, rainy days that required the use of an umbrella all day and cool, blowy days, which often occur during the summer months, are good days to leave the straw hat at home and substitute a soft hat, cap, or derby. Because they used natural straw and were out in the sun, straw hats tended to last only one season before the straw would start to unfurl and the bright ribbon would fade. The hat was first made popular in the first half of the 19th century as a children's hat. By the 1860s, it was being worn commonly by women, but it wasn't until the 1880s that it became popular among men. The hat reached its popularity in a time when it was expected that a man would always wear some type of hat out of doors. While it was associated with leisure activities, the boater was actually seen as a semi-formal hat, the summer version of a Homburg. By the turn of the century, straw boater hats were considered an essential part of summer wear, but they were subject to the odd cultural device of fashion rules. Fashion rules are strange things whose origins are often obtuse, but in late 19th century America, the rules were serious. Fashion rules represented class struggles, economic and immigration trends. The people who were in decided what was out, and whether a person wore what was in or out was used as a social measuring stick. For example, while the exact origin of the long-held fashion prohibition against wearing white after Labor Day is unclear, its early enforcement was really a measure of wealth. Wealthy families could afford to escape East Coast cities during the hot and muggy summers, going to the countryside where it was cooler. As cities in the time were filthy for a number of reasons, but especially because of coal soot smoke, it was impossible to keep a white dress clean in the city. Thus, wearing white in summer, while it may have something to do with reflecting heat, was actually a class measure. It separated the wealthy from those poor souls who had to spend summer in New York City. Boater hats had a similar tradition. Felt hats were expected to be worn in the winter and straw hats in summer. This is more than just a matter of practicality. The shift came to be specifically recognized as Straw Hat Day. It's not clear when Straw Hat Day originated, but a 1908 issue of the New York Times opined that straw hats should come with the strawberries. That is, it became appropriate to wear straw hats at the time that strawberries ripened. The op-ed went so far as to opine that New Yorkers who wanted to wear straw hats before what was then recognized as the appropriate day, June 15th, should move south, where strawberries ripened earlier. The rule apparently relaxed, however, with time, as by the mid-1920s, Straw Hat Day in New York was generally recognized to be May 1st, although the official day varied all over the country. There might have been reasons for such a rule, but one was certainly economic. Hat manufacturers knew when to have items in stock, and Straw Hat Day is a genius selling technique, literally a day when people were expected to buy a new hat. But there was the corresponding day in the fall, Felt Hat Day, the day that men were expected to give up their straw hats and shift to felt. By the turn of the century, that day seems to have been generally recognized as September 15th and was the genesis of a Wall Street tradition. Stockbrokers would traditionally wear their straw hats to work on the trading floor that day, and as a symbolic nod to the end of summer, at the end of the day they would throw their hats on the ground and crush them. Perhaps they were buying stock in hat companies. While some were willing to challenge the rule, the Wall Street tradition became something of a national tradition. If a man was seen wearing the hat after September 15th, someone would snatch it off his head and crush it, a fate that was usually accepted good-naturedly. Still, there were those who questioned the rule. The New York Times editorialized on September 15, 1922, "The origin of this law is obscure. Certainly it's not based on American meteorology. But reflection justifies at least the suspicion that it originated in the dark machinations of the only class that has an interest in its perpetuation." The Times had reason to complain. The city at the time was in the midst of straw hat chaos. The trouble started the evening of September 13th. Although it was 2 days before straw hats were supposed to disappear for winter, it was a particularly hot day, drawing out hordes of late-season skimmers on the streets of Gotham. But the long-worn day also drew out hoodlums, what the Times described as boys and others with undeveloped minds who delight in destruction for its own sake. On the theory that they had the right to declare open season on straw hats on other persons' heads, the paper reported, scores of rowdies on the east side and other parts of the city started smashing other people's hats. If hat smashing seems frivolous, Peter A. Hatting, the aptly named magistrate of the city's men's night court, disagreed. A man's hat, he explained, is just as much a man's property and just as much to be defended as a man's watch. The magistrate wasn't just talking theoretically. When a group of youths tried to start smashing the hats of a group of dock workers, the workers fought back. The fighting turned into a brawl which stopped traffic on the Manhattan Bridge. There were dangers of riots breaking out in several parts of the city. Straw hat bonfires were started. Police reserves had to be called out. 7 hat smashers were brought to the night court by police on the night of the 13th. Magistrate Hatting slapped them with stiff $5 fines and threatened to jail the next hat smasher brought in. The threat was intended to send a message. To hit a man's hat, the magistrate declared, is a simple assault, and in this court, it will be treated as such. The hope was that the magistrate's strong stand would curb the behavior. It didn't. More hat smashing occurred the following 2 nights. The Buffalo Times observed that the appearance of a straw hat was a signal for rapid entrance of gangs of hoodlums. Gangs of youths attacked hats, and sometimes the owners, if they tried to defend their property. 25-year-old Harry Gerber had to be taken to Harlem Hospital after he was badly kicked and beaten while trying to fight off straw hat vandals. Often the youths would use a long stick with a hooked nail at the end to grab hats right off people's heads. They even lined streetcar tracks using the sticks to knock the hats off passengers as the cars rolled by. One New Yorker reported that the mob of hat smashers along Amsterdam Avenue numbered as much as 1,000. The Tribune declared that the carnival prevailed from the Battery to the Bronx. Even plainclothes police were accosted. The Buffalo Times explained the police were kept busy, but there weren't enough of them, and there were too many hats. The Times reported that, in some cases, hundreds of boys and young men terrorized whole blocks and lamented that, as soon as police broke up the gangs in one district, the hoodlums resumed their activities elsewhere. Hatting continued his hard stance to those arrested, but many were youths, too young to be tried as adults. According to the Tribune, when police brought 7 boys, all below the age of 15, into the 104th Street station, the lieutenant invited the boys' fathers to come to the station and spank them, and the invitation was cordially accepted. But some were old enough for the magistrate's court. Morris Sikowitz was apprehended by New Yorker Harry Oldbaum, who chased him down after he and a group of hoodlums knocked off his hat. Sikowitz was 16, old enough to be tried in court, and so was charged with disorderly conduct. Hatting fully planned to make good on his promise to jail the next hat smasher brought into his courtroom. Even Oldbaum objected, intervening on behalf of the boy, thinking that a jail sentence was excessive. But it was the appearance of Sikowitz's 70-year-old gray-haired mother that caused Hatting to relent, for her sake, sending the boy home with a fine. But, Hatting declared, I'll send the next one to jail. The unlucky offender was A. Silverman, sentenced to 3 days in jail. The violence quieted after the night of the 15th. New Yorkers seemed to have finally accepted that straw hat season was over. Buffalo Times gave 2 reasons for this. 1, the weather turned noticeably cooler, and 2, most of the straw hats had been destroyed the night before. The street sweepers were said to have been kept quite busy, sweeping up all the broken straw hats. It's hard to divine the underlying cause of the straw hat riots. It might have had something to do with class, but really it might have just been the weather. September 15th was described as a perfect day in New York, which brought out not just a lot of men in straw hats, but also the hoodlums that wanted to destroy them. But a few newspapers did note that the straw hat destruction seemed to occur most in the vicinity of hat stores, which did a brisk business selling felt hats to replace the broken straw hats, suggesting that there might have been some sort of bounty paid to the hoodlums under the table. There were some examples of straw hat violence in subsequent years, but the straw hat riots of 1922, where more than a dozen people were arrested, were by far the worst. Slowly with time, the boater hat fell out of fashion, and that prohibition of September 15th faded. In 1925, President Calvin Coolidge was famously photographed wearing a straw hat all the way on September 20th, perhaps shattering the rule for good. If you enjoyed this History Guy short, then feel free to click that like button, subscribe to our channel, and check us out on Patreon, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and our merchandise on teespring.com.